Hello again, chapter 7, the end of faith. I didn't realize it's the last chapter of the book. So I'm basically finished the book. All I have is left. There is quite an extensive epilogue and afterword. And then the notes are extremely extensive. And I have to confess, I didn't read all of the notes as I was reading the book. I zeroed in on a few of them and read them, but there's many more notes that I could read if I wanted to read it a second time. That being said, chapter 7, we finished. It's the final chapter of the book, and he really does come out with a direct challenge, I guess you could say. I wouldn't call it an attack, but it's a direct challenge to Christianity itself. And that's not surprising, because so far in pretty much all the atheistic literature that I've read, it winds up being an attack on Jesus Christ in some form of another, or at least a challenge to Jesus. And this one is no different. However, I can understand his frustration. He calls the title of the chapter Experiments in Consciousness. So he's examining consciousness. That's his expertise, being from his studies in neurology and all that kind of stuff. I imagine the brain. But he sort of says that becoming like Jesus is impossible, is his conclusion from his examination of the Christian dogma, or Christian articles of faith, as he might call it. He says that becoming like Jesus is impossible. One can only enumerate one's sins, believe the unbelievable, and await the end of the world. So he has kind of that futile, fatalistic view, which is not surprising, because it's a view that's very often promulgated and promoted from pulpits across the country, right? This is a very common view of Christianity, because that's how Christianity is very commonly presented. However, I'd like to point out a few things about Christianity that he may or may not be aware of himself. And so he also takes he finishes off, he places Jesus on a par with other men. Of course, he says the testimony of Jesus, as well as countless other men and women over the ages, attest to this, that a more profound experiences are possible. He admits that there's some type of extraordinary experiences that are possible for humans, but Jesus alludes to it, but so have many other men. And the challenge, he says, is to look at this possibility in rational terms. This is his conclusion. He says we can't find these extraordinary experiences available to our consciousness. We know they're available because people have experienced, had transcendent experiences and what have you, but he says it's not to be found in Christianity. And he makes a second dig at Jesus at the beginning of the next topic, which is called the search for happiness, where he says, though the lilies of the field are admirably clothed, you and I were driven from the womb naked and squalling. And that is a play on words of a teaching from Christ, where he says, look at the lilies of the field. They're clothed better than Solomon. God's going to take care of you just as well. He kind of refutes that by saying, hey, wait a minute, we didn't come into our existence fully clothed. It's kind of a cheap shot at the words of Christ. I mean, that's between him and Jesus, but you get a sense that Sam Harris is essentially wanting to be the Messiah of atheism. He wants to be the, he's envious of Christ because of the effect Christ has had on the history of humanity, and he kind of, doesn't like that. Likes to take a little dig here and there, because in his view, it's founded too much on leaps of faith, as it's been called by various philosophers down through the ages. He doesn't like leaps of faith. However, he moves on through the chapter, and he takes his own leap of faith, which I think is quite startling, which I'm going to mention to you now. Well, I might as well stick with my notes then. Here, I'll just make one mention here, page 206. He talks about our consciousness was very alone. We're by ourselves. We only have an awareness that we're all alone within our minds. And but before I get to that, sorry, I missed one point. He says that there's a form of well-being that is intrinsic to consciousness in every present moment. So he's talking about the present moment, and he said that it seems to lie at the core of many of our religions, and yet it's by no means always easy to discern among the articles of faith. So he's saying that religion may have alluded to this, awareness of the consciousness, and I would call that abiding in Christ. And he's saying that you're all alone. On the next page, I'm saying no. Christ said, "Behold, I'm with you always," right? So the teaching of Christ is that he can be with our consciousness at all times. So we always have somebody to talk to, and it would go back to his, stories about Purple Friend and things like that, and the childlike faith. It is a childlike faith, right? If you believe that he's with you and you can speak to him, he'll speak back to you. And people say, well, that's just, mental illness. You can't do that. Well, that's the instructions. So I can only tell him. And what he does instead of accepting that, he switches over to metaphysical concepts, which I'll mention in a second here. He says, if we can recognize our identity as consciousness itself, as a mere witness of appearances, we shall realize that we stand perpetually free of the vicissitudes of experience. So he starts to move into the metaphysical, and he uses Buddhist thought as an example. Now, he makes the bold claim that he says that, I'll just take it word for word here. He says that mysticism, not metaphysicalism. Mysticism is a rational enterprise. Religion is not. Now, where does he get the idea that mysticism is a rational enterprise? You would think if somebody thought that religion was not a rational enterprise, and surely he doesn't, he goes a step beyond religion, and he goes to Buddhism, and he says that it's rigorously empirical versus metaphysical, which is interesting. Now, as proof of that, he takes a random sampling of Buddhist literature, he presents it in the chapter, and then he says, see what I'm talking about? See how rigorously empirical this is? I've just picked this at random, and it talks so clearly about the consciousness and the inner self and the inner state of being and all that. But he picked a random piece of Buddhist literature, and it shows that it's essentially metaphysical in nature. I mean, I think a lot of people would argue with him on that point, more than I would, that Buddhism is itself considered an Eastern religion. It's considered an Eastern religion. And the principles that it promotes are a type of mysticism, because you can take a random sample of the literature, and it's all talking about the same kind of buzzwords. It's all like, inner self and the inner being and the balance. And he mentions some of the words, clarity, emptiness, single flavor. And you would think of all people that Sam Harris would say, well, those are kind of very general, mystical concepts, which are very open to interpretation concerning finding your inner self and your inner purpose, and not thinking and emptying the mind, and then you just are at one with the immediate moment and at one with your consciousness, kind of thing. Kind of a who would be the guy? Eckhart Tolle would appeal to that type of teaching. But I would venture to say that sounds very mystical to me. But in any event, that's his argument. And so he promotes the idea of that form of mystical viewpoint as a valid viewpoint, because it leads to things like meditation and perhaps a greater control of the mind over things like anger. So kind of like leaning towards a stoicism type of thinking, and it's reflected in his character. That guy is really very centered. When you hear him speak, he's very calm, he's very peaceful, he doesn't lose his temper or anything like that. He's has very good control over his thoughts and his mannerisms and behavior, etc., etc. And so that's about it for chapter 7. He talks about meditation, and as I mentioned, he talks about Buddhism, and he goes into a lot of detail about the perspective of the self, the I, he calls it, right? As soon as you get old enough, you start realizing that you are an I, or a person, an individual, a consciousness. And so interesting reading, but it kind of, again, it kind of ends on a whimper. I haven't started in the epilogue yet, but I already noticed that in the first paragraph he says that religious faith is a species of human ignorance that does not even admit the possibility of correction. So he has a view of religion that is extremely rigid. It hasn't changed since the 1400s, and it will not change, whereas we do see quite a bit of, even within the religion of Catholicism, where they always have these different papal edicts and they change their viewpoint a little bit here, a little bit there, and they've actually changed a lot of all kinds of different things that they've made decisions on about what's okay and what's not. So I think he's a little bit extreme in his perception of religion, but he's even more extreme in his perception of Christianity, and then even more so in his perception of Christ, because he gets hung up on the specifics of the life of Christ, in particular the virgin birth, for example. He's unable to accept that. So, I mean, it's very interesting. I still have to read the epilogue and the afterword, and I really should go through the notes to give it a fair reading. But I'm surprised it finished so quickly. It's very concise. It really doesn't pull any punches. If your faith can survive this type of analysis, then you should be okay, right? You have to look at it and say, okay, what is this person saying? He's got a lot of really good points to evaluate. So, yeah, I will read the afterword, the epilogue, I should say, and the afterword, and that's another. It's not that much actually. It's only another. Where are we here? 237 to 223. So another 14 pages left, and then that's it. I'm done, and I can move on to my next one. I believe I'm moving on to is Christopher Hitchens. God is Not Good is the book that he wrote. Sounds like a pretty harsh title, but that's the next one on my list that I have waiting in the wings. And so I'll probably make at least one more video about this book, perhaps two, to cover the epilogue and afterward. But my feeling on it right now is, I mean, it's interesting. It's very interesting because this is, you can see the kind of results in our society today of the effect of this style of thinking, right? The idea that let's move God out of the picture. Let's try and get rid of religion as much as we can and move towards atheism. The unfortunate result of that is that atheism results in a lack of importance for the individual person, for the individual experience. And I mean, I hate to say that Christianity is a self-centered type of religion. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that it's a religion that is reaching out to people on an individual basis. So it's not just saying, well, it's all about you because God loves you so much, and all about you and all about you and all about you. But to someone that's hurting and in pain and doesn't understand life, that is the message, right? The message is that God really does love you on an individual one-to-one basis, and that there's a possibility of reconciliation to God in that effect of communication with God on an individual basis through prayer, through seeking Him, through listening to the instructions of Christ. If you simply hold back a little bit on all the 66 books and just stick with one to start with, the Gospel of John, and leave off all these arguments about this and that and the Old Testament and why this can't be and that can't be and this is conflicting with that and this, you know, it's kind of like making it more complex than it needs to be. And it's funny because he ends the book with an acceptance of meditation as something that is just, what term does he use again? I don't want to put words in his mouth whenever I can help it. That's not a good thing to do. He calls it a rational enterprise. Well, I would say the same thing about the words of Christ. I would say that they are rational. that they are helpful, that they are practical, that they can be put into practice, where you say, okay, I'm going to maybe seek God through fasting and prayer, and I'm going to try and read the words of Christ and see if something happens in my life. I'm going to seek God and see if he shows up, and go into my inner prayer closet, close the door. He even gave us an example of a prayer to use, right? So it's not really complex. It's not like, oh, I have to really go up on a mountaintop and try and find God. That's what Christ said. He said, it's not far from you. He said, it's within you. He said, it's as close to every person as their breath. It's as close to them as looking inward and saying, God, have mercy on me, a sinner, right? Reveal yourself to me. Rescue me from the circumstances that I'm facing in my life. And this is something that, he comes to the conclusion in his reasoning. He comes to the conclusion, well, you have to endorse torture. Why does he say that? Or he has to endorse war, killing, or those kind of things? Because he said, if you have an evil person and they're armed with a knife, and then you have a city of it doesn't matter, thousands of people that are passive, then the bully or the evil person would overrun everybody else and kill everybody else. So his reasoning is you have to, and I'm not going to get into the whole argument there, because that's taking it off on a far different direction. But the conclusions that he reaches using atheism as a foundation are currently, I think most people would agree, are unsatisfactory. This is probably why atheism has been slow to be adopted, because it doesn't offer any type of ethical foundation which even sounds remotely compassionate or helpful to the human condition. It if anything, it results in more of a nihilism, more of a futility that, well, is pointless anyway, because it's just a random chance that we happen to be here. So there's no meaning to it. And unless they can create something out of nothing, they're left with the task of trying to create meaning out of nothingness. So they basically worked themselves into a corner mentally by coming up with the idea as atheism as being a viable worldview. So they're the ones that's in the corner. So if they want to find a way out of it, and Sam has given little inklings, little hints that he has left the door open for theism himself. He said, well, if it was beyond this type of dogma, if it was beyond this type of unreasonableness, and when he mentions those types of unreasonableness, most of the time he has a very good point. A lot of the points that he makes reveal the ridiculousness of most religion. And so this is something that I would call it the modern day Christian, or the person that's willing to turn their brain on and think, should look at it and say, hey, what is what's being preached to me from the pulpit relevant to the world at large? Is it helpful in my condition, or is it just repent, send your money, and see you next week? It's kind of turned into some type of echo chamber of nonsensical, sometimes totally unproductive nitpicking and pharisaical rule keeping is all it's become. And that's an absolute shame, because the teachings of Christ, the words of Christ, are very spiritual in and of themselves, and they can lead a person, not just the words themselves, but feeding on those words can have a synergistic effect. I believe that they can allow the person to apply the love one another concept into their home, into their life, into their community, in spite of all the failures that we have. We tear each other apart and we go bonkers and we get upset because our buttons get pushed by those that are close to us, and sometimes we make horrible mistakes. But this is the hope that we have. We keep on pressing forward to hope that God is molding us in this process of our failures, that he's molding us and shaping us and saying, see, that's why I said that. You see, that's why this makes sense. You see, that's why there's hope for the world. So hopefully I can move forward, and I'm glad that I read it, but I'm going to go back again and read The Moral Landscape probably one more time, just to see if Sam has got any other tricks in that particular book that might help in my search for truth. That's the path that I'm on. And thank you so much for watching. God bless you. I love you. I hope you're doing great. And if you're forced to study this in school, don't let it throw you off. It's just arguing and just a different perspective. That's all it is. Thanks a lot for watching. God bless you. Take care now. Bye-bye.